A millionaire's son humiliates a beggar. What happens next leaves him in tears. The streets buzzed with life as Lucas strolled down the bustling avenue, flanked by his group of friends. Dressed in sharp suits and designer sunglasses, they were the picture of wealth and privilege. Every few steps, Lucas would glance at his reflection in the windows of the high-end boutiques they passed, adjusting his cufflinks or brushing non-existent lint off his tailored jacket. His laughter echoed loudly, drowning out the softer sounds of city life. As they walked, Lucas spotted an elderly man sitting on the sidewalk. The man's clothes were tattered, his skin weathered from long days under the sun. Beside him sat a tin cup, its dull metallic surface catching faint glimmers of light. Lucas smirked and nudged one of his friends, nodding toward the man. "Check this out," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. He pulled out a crisp bill, rolled it into a small cylinder, and flicked it toward the man's cup. It missed and fell just short of the beggar's outstretched hand. "Oops," Lucas said, chuckling. His friends burst into laughter, one of them adding, "Hey, maybe that's a sign he doesn't deserve it." The beggar looked up, his expression calm despite the humiliation. His piercing eyes locked onto Lucas's, making the young man falter ever so slightly. Then, in a low, steady voice, the man said, "You may have everything, but that doesn't mean you own your soul." Lucas blinked, caught off guard. For a moment, the laughter around him faded as the man's words hung in the air. But the moment passed quickly, and Lucas shook his head, smirking once more. "Whatever, old man," he muttered, turning away. As they continued walking, Lucas's friends kept the jokes going. "Can you believe these people?" one of them said. "Acting like they're wiser just because they've been poor for longer." Lucas laughed along, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the beggar's face. There was something unsettling about the way the man had looked at him, not with anger, but with a quiet certainty, as though he had seen through Lucas entirely. Later that evening, Lucas joined his father, Edward, for dinner in their sprawling mansion. The dining room was as grand as a palace, with towering ceilings, chandeliers, and a long table set with fine china. Edward, a self-made millionaire, was known for his no-nonsense approach to life. Despite his success, he was a man of discipline and humility, traits Lucas had never quite inherited. "You're late," Edward said without looking up from his meal. "Sorry, got caught up with some friends," Lucas replied, slipping into his chair and immediately reaching for the breadbasket. Edward's sharp eyes met his son's across the table. "Caught up with friends or showing off again?" Lucas rolled his eyes. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I've seen enough of your antics to know when you're acting out of arrogance," Edward replied. He set down his fork and leaned forward. "Lucas, wealth is a tool, not a shield. If you keep treating people like they're beneath you, it's going to catch up with you." Lucas leaned back, a smirk playing on his lips. "Come on, lighten up. Not everyone's as serious as you are." Edward's expression hardened. "It's not about being serious. It's about respect. Something you clearly don't understand yet." The conversation ended there, but the tension lingered. After dinner, Lucas retreated to his room, brushing off his father's words as just another lecture. Yet, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the beggar's calm gaze and cryptic words crept back into his thoughts. The next day, Lucas met his friends at an upscale cafe. The group lounged in the outdoor seating area, sipping overpriced lattes and scrolling through their phones. Lucas was recounting an exaggerated version of the beggar encounter, embellishing details to make it funnier. "And then he said something about owning my soul," Lucas said, laughing. "Like he's some kind of philosopher or something." His friends erupted into laughter, one of them nearly choking on his drink. "Man, these people are something else," another said. "They think just because they're at rock bottom, they've got all the wisdom in the world." As the laughter subsided, Lucas noticed a figure approaching. It was the same beggar, his slow steps and quiet demeanor a stark contrast to the lively cafe. Lucas's smirk returned, and he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Well, he said, loud enough for the beggar to hear. "Look who decided to join us. Are you here for another donation?" The beggar didn't respond right away. Instead, he stopped a few feet from the table, his gaze steady. "I'm here for food," he said simply. "I haven't eaten in 2 days." Lucas's friends exchanged amused glances. One of them muttered, "Here we go," while another stifled a laugh. Lucas gestured to the waiter, his tone mockingly grand. "Bring our friend here some bread or something. We wouldn't want him to starve, would we?" The waiter hesitated, glancing between Lucas and the beggar. "Sir, we don't normally." "Just do it," Lucas interrupted, waving dismissively. As the waiter walked away, Lucas turned back to the beggar. "There you go. Happy now?" The beggar nodded, his expression unchanged. "Happiness isn't found in handouts," he said. "It's found in the kindness behind them." The words landed like a punch, but Lucas hid his discomfort behind a forced laugh. "Right," he said, waving him off. "Enjoy your bread." Later that evening, Lucas's father called him into the study. Edward's face was tight with barely contained anger, and his phone screen was lit with a video. "What's this?" Edward asked, his voice low but firm. Lucas leaned in to see the screen. It was a recording of the cafe encounter, captured by a passerby. The video had already gone viral, with comments flooding in, condemning Lucas's behavior. "Seriously?" Lucas muttered. "Who cares what some strangers think?" "I care," Edward snapped. "Because this isn't just about you. It's about this family, our name, and the values I've worked my whole life to uphold." Lucas crossed his arms. "What do you want me to do? Apologize to a stranger?" Edward's eyes narrowed. "No. I want you to understand what it means to live without the safety net you've taken for granted. Starting tomorrow, your life is going to change." Lucas scoffed. "What does that even mean?" "You'll find out soon enough," Edward said, his tone final. The next morning, Lucas's alarm blared far earlier than usual, pulling him from the comfort of his luxurious bed. He groggily reached for his phone and saw a single message from his father. "Your duties begin today. Be at the community center by 7 a.m. sharp. Don't be late." Lucas stared at the message, disbelief washing over him. He thought his father was bluffing the night before, but now it was clear Edward wasn't kidding. Rolling out of bed, Lucas muttered complaints under his breath as he shuffled into the shower. When Lucas arrived at the community center, he immediately felt out of place. The modest building was a far cry from the sleek offices and exclusive clubs he usually frequented. People were already bustling about, volunteers unloading boxes of supplies, others scrubbing floors, and some setting up for a meal service. Lucas, dressed in a designer jacket and polished loafers, stuck out like a sore thumb. Edward was waiting for him inside, his expression stern. "You're late," he said, glancing at his watch. "It's 2 minutes past 7. Lucas protested. "Late is late," Edward replied curtly. "Follow me." Lucas trailed behind his father, grumbling under his breath. They walked into a small supply room where Edward handed Lucas a plain uniform, an old pair of jeans and a faded t-shirt. "What's this?" Lucas asked, holding the clothes at arm's length like they were contaminated. "Your new work attire," Edward said. "You can't clean floors and haul boxes in designer clothes. Change now." Lucas glared but realized he had no choice. He changed in silence, emerging from the room feeling stripped of his identity. Gone was the polished image he had so carefully crafted. Edward led him back to the main area, where a familiar figure was waiting. It was the beggar from the cafe. Lucas froze, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "This is Robert," Edward said. "He'll be supervising you." Robert nodded, his expression calm and unreadable. "Good morning, Lucas," he said. Lucas couldn't bring himself to meet Robert's gaze. Instead, he muttered a half-hearted, "Morning." Edward placed a firm hand on Lucas's shoulder. "You'll spend the next few weeks working here. No shortcuts, no excuses. You'll do everything Robert asks of you." "Are you serious?" Lucas asked, his voice rising in frustration. "Dead serious," Edward replied. "This isn't punishment, Lucas. It's education. Now get to work." With that, Edward left, leaving Lucas standing awkwardly next to Robert. Robert handed Lucas a mop and bucket. "We're starting with the floors," he said. "The dining area needs to be cleaned before lunch service begins." Lucas stared at the mop like it was a foreign object. "You want me to mop floors?" "Yes," Robert replied simply. "That's what happens when people eat here." They make a mess and someone has to clean it. Grumbling, Lucas dipped the mop into the bucket and began swiping it across the tiled floor. The work was tedious, and Lucas's inexperience showed. He splashed water everywhere and left streaks behind. Robert watched silently for a while before stepping in to demonstrate the proper technique. Small, even strokes, Robert instructed. Take your time. You're not in a race. Lucas rolled his eyes but followed the instructions. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice the people around him. Volunteers moved with purpose, chatting and laughing as they prepared meals and organized supplies. Some of the guests arrived early, forming a line outside the door. They were from all walks of life, families with children, elderly men and women, even a few young professionals who had fallen on hard times. For the first time, Lucas saw the faces behind the statistics he'd always ignored. These weren't just nameless, faceless, poor people. They were individuals, each with their own stories, struggles, and dignity. By midday, Lucas's arms ached and his back was sore. He slumped against a wall, wiping sweat from his brow. Robert approached, handing him a bottle of water. "You're doing fine," Robert said. Lucas snorted. "Yeah, right. This is a joke." "It's only a joke if you treat it like one," Robert replied. "You might learn something if you open your eyes." Lucas didn't respond, but Robert's words lingered in his mind as the day went on. Later that afternoon, Lucas was tasked with helping serve meals. He stood behind the counter, ladling soup into bowls as guests filed past. At first, he avoided eye contact, embarrassed by his new role. But as the line moved, he began to notice the small interactions, the gratitude in people's eyes, the way a warm meal could brighten someone's day. One guest, a young girl no older than 10, smiled up at him as he handed her a bowl of soup. "Thank you," she said softly. Lucas hesitated, his usual sarcastic demeanor faltering. "You're welcome," he said, his voice quieter than usual. As the day wound down, Lucas found himself in the storage room with Robert, organizing boxes of canned goods. The work was repetitive, but Lucas found it strangely calming. "You know," Robert said suddenly, breaking the silence, "I wasn't always in this position." Lucas glanced at him. "What do you mean?" Robert reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn photograph. It showed a younger version of himself, standing beside another man in a business suit. "That's me," Robert said, pointing to the photo. "And that's your father." Lucas stared at the photo, stunned. "You know my dad?" "I do," Robert replied. "He wouldn't be where he is today without me. But life has a funny way of humbling you when you least expect it." Lucas didn't know what to say. For the first time, he saw Robert not as a beggar, but as a man with a story that might hold more lessons than he was ready to admit. Lucas stared at the photograph in silence. The man standing beside his father looked nothing like the disheveled figure who now stood before him. In the photo, Robert was polished, confident, and well-dressed, a man who commanded respect. Lucas struggled to reconcile the two images. "My dad never mentioned you," Lucas said, his voice quiet, almost uncertain. Robert smiled faintly, tucking the photograph back into his pocket. "He wouldn't. It's not something he likes to talk about. But he knows what I did for him." "What did you do?" Lucas asked, the curiosity gnawing at him. Robert leaned against one of the storage shelves, his expression thoughtful. "Years ago, when your father was just starting out, he was struggling to keep his business afloat. He had big dreams but no money to back them up. I believed in him, so I gave him a loan. It wasn't much, but it was everything I had at the time." Lucas frowned. "You gave him all your money? Why would you do that?" "Because I saw potential in him," Robert replied simply. "And because I believed that helping others when you can is the right thing to do." Lucas scoffed, shaking his head. "And look where that got you." Robert's smile didn't waver. "It's true, things didn't work out for me the way I'd hoped. I made some bad decisions, trusted the wrong people. But I don't regret helping your father. He built something incredible from that loan, and I take pride in knowing I played a part in that." Lucas was quiet, his mind racing. He thought of his father's lectures about humility and respect, how Edward always seemed to carry a weight of responsibility despite his success. This revelation added a layer of complexity to everything Lucas thought he knew about his family. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Lucas continued his tasks at the community center, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Robert's story. That evening, as he sat in his room, he couldn't shake the image of the photograph or the calm certainty in Robert's voice. The next morning, Lucas arrived at the community center with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. He found Robert in the kitchen, preparing trays of food for the lunch service. "Hey," Lucas said awkwardly. Robert glanced up, raising an eyebrow. "Morning. You're early." Lucas hesitated, then said, "I want to help. Like really help. Not just because my dad told me to." Robert studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, let's get to work." Over the next few weeks, Lucas's attitude began to shift. He stopped complaining about the tasks he was assigned and started taking initiative. He spent time talking to the guests at the shelter, listening to their stories and learning about their struggles. He even began to understand the camaraderie among the volunteers, their shared purpose giving him a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in his superficial social circles. One afternoon, as they worked together to restock the pantry, Lucas asked Robert, "Why do you still do this? After everything you've been through, why keep helping people?" Robert smiled, the lines on his face softening. "Because it's not about me. It's about the impact I can have on others. Wealth comes and goes, Lucas, but kindness? That lasts." Those words stuck with Lucas. Slowly but surely, he began to see the truth in them. One day, Lucas's father arrived at the community center unannounced. Edward found Lucas in the dining hall, serving food to the guests. The sight stopped Edward in his tracks. "Lucas," Edward called out, his tone softer than usual. Lucas turned, surprised to see his father. "Dad? What are you doing here?" "I came to check on you," Edward said, walking over. "I've been hearing good things." Lucas shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I'm just doing my part." Edward looked around, taking in the bustling atmosphere of the center. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. For the first time in years, Lucas felt a genuine warmth in his father's words. That evening, as they drove home together, Lucas broke the silence. "Why didn't you ever tell me about Robert?" Edward sighed, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "Because I didn't want to burden you with my past. Robert gave me a chance when no one else would. I've always carried that with me, but I didn't know how to explain it to you without it sounding like a lecture." "It's not a burden," Lucas said. "It's the inspiring." "He's inspiring." Edward glanced at his son, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Yes. And it seems like he's inspired you too?" Lucas nodded, a sense of clarity settling over him. In the weeks that followed, Lucas threw himself into his work at the community center. He organized fundraisers, connected with local businesses to secure donations, and even started a mentorship program for younger volunteers. His transformation didn't go unnoticed by his father, the volunteers, or even Robert. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Robert approached Lucas with a small box. "What's this?" Lucas asked. "A gift," Robert said. Lucas opened the box to find the photograph of Robert and Edward, now framed. Beneath it was a handwritten note. "Wealth is measured by the lives you touch. Keep this as a reminder of who you are and who you can become." Lucas felt a lump in his throat as he looked up at Robert. "Thank you for everything." Robert placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "Thank you, Lucas. You've proven that change is possible. Now go make a difference." As Robert walked away, Lucas stood there holding the photograph, his heart full. He knew his journey was just beginning, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it, not as the arrogant son of a millionaire, but as someone determined to use his privilege to uplift others. And as the doors of the community center closed behind him, Lucas whispered to himself, "Wealth isn't what you have. It's what you give." In the months that followed, Lucas's transformation became undeniable. He was no longer the self-centered, entitled young man he once was. His days were filled with purpose as he continued his work at the community center and expanded his efforts into the broader community. The mentorship program he started began to gain traction, attracting young people from all walks of life who wanted to learn, give back, and grow. Lucas's social media, once filled with posts flaunting his wealth and indulgent lifestyle, now showcased stories of the people he worked with. Each post was a tribute to the resilience, kindness, and strength of the individuals he had met. The comments shifted too. People applauded his efforts, inspired by his newfound humility and dedication. One day, Lucas approached his father with an idea. "Dad, I want to start a foundation," he said during a dinner conversation. Edward raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "A foundation?" "Yes," Lucas said, his voice steady with conviction. "To help people like the ones I've met at the community center. It could fund job training, housing support, and education programs. We've got the resources and I want to use them for something meaningful." Edward leaned back in his chair, a small smile forming on his face. "I've been waiting to hear you say something like that. Let's do it." The Lucas Marshall Foundation was launched a few months later, with a mission to uplift underprivileged communities through sustainable programs. Lucas poured his energy into every aspect of it, meeting with stakeholders, listening to community leaders, and ensuring that the foundation's initiatives were impactful and transparent. His father provided guidance but allowed Lucas to take the reins, proud of the man his son was becoming. One day, during a foundation event, Lucas spotted Robert in the crowd. The older man had been keeping a lower profile lately, but Lucas had made sure to invite him to the event, knowing it wouldn't have been possible without Robert's influence. As Lucas approached, Robert smiled warmly. "This is impressive," Robert said, gesturing to the bustling event around them. "It's because of you," Lucas replied. "You showed me what really matters." Robert shook his head. "You found it yourself. I just gave you a nudge." The two shared a quiet moment of understanding before Lucas was called away to give a speech. He stood at the podium, looking out at the audience, which included his father, Robert, and many of the people who had inspired him along the way. "I used to think wealth was about what you could buy or how much you had," Lucas began, his voice steady. "But I've learned that true wealth is about what you can give, how you can use what you have to make a difference. It's not about living for yourself but living for others." The crowd erupted in applause, but Lucas's focus remained on the faces in front of him, his father, Robert, the volunteers, and the people whose stories had shaped his journey. He knew this was only the beginning. As the event wound down, Lucas found Robert one last time. "You're coming to the next one, right?" Lucas asked, half joking. "We'll see," Robert replied with a twinkle in his eye. "I think you're doing just fine on your own." Lucas laughed, knowing Robert wasn't entirely serious. But he also understood what Robert was trying to say. The torch had been passed, and Lucas was ready to carry it. That evening, as Lucas sat in his office, surrounded by plans for the foundation's next steps, he picked up the framed photograph Robert had given him. The image of his father and Robert felt like a reminder of how interconnected their lives were, how the smallest acts of kindness could ripple into something far greater. Lucas whispered the words that had become his mantra: "Wealth is measured by the lives you touch." And with that, he got back to work, knowing there were still many lives to touch, many stories to change, and many more ways to make a difference. His journey was far from over, but this time, he knew he was on the right path. The Lucas Marshall Foundation grew rapidly, earning recognition for its innovative programs and impactful work. Lucas's leadership transformed the organization into a symbol of hope and opportunity for underserved communities. Over time, its reach expanded beyond the city, touching rural areas, neighboring states, and eventually international communities in need. Lucas often visited the Foundation's projects personally, walking alongside those it served and listening to their stories. He had learned from Robert that true leadership wasn't about issuing commands from a distance but being present, connecting with people, and understanding their needs. One of the Foundation's most ambitious projects was a vocational training program aimed at empowering unemployed individuals with skills in technology, healthcare, and trades. At the grand opening of the first training center, Lucas spoke to a crowd of eager participants. "This isn't just about skills," Lucas said, his voice carrying conviction. "It's about giving people the tools to take control of their lives, to rewrite their stories. Everyone deserves a chance to thrive." The center's success was almost immediate. Graduates found jobs that allowed them to support their families, and some even returned to the center as mentors, paying forward the opportunities they had received. The impact of these programs rippled outward, transforming not just individual lives but entire communities. Meanwhile, Lucas's relationship with his father deepened. Edward, who had always been a reserved man, began to open up about his own struggles in building his business. One evening, as they sat in the garden of their mansion, Edward shared something that Lucas had never known. "There was a time when I thought I'd lose everything," Edward admitted, his tone quiet but firm. "Robert believed in me when no one else did. He gave me a second chance, and I've spent my life trying to live up to that." Lucas listened intently, his respect for his father growing. "You've done more than live up to it," he said. "And now, I want to make sure we carry that legacy forward." Edward placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "You already are. And I couldn't be prouder." Their bond, once strained by miscommunication and mismatched values, became one of mutual admiration and shared purpose. Together, they worked to expand the foundation, using their resources and influence to tackle systemic issues like education inequality, housing insecurity, and access to healthcare. Despite the foundation's success, Lucas never forgot the lessons he had learned at the community center. He often returned, not as the entitled young man who had once mopped floors reluctantly, but as someone eager to reconnect with his roots. The volunteers welcomed him warmly, and Robert, though he had stepped back from daily involvement, always made time to catch up with Lucas. One day, during one of these visits, Robert revealed that he was planning to move out of the city. "It's time for me to start fresh," Robert said, his tone light but firm. "I've done what I can here, but there are other places that need help." Lucas felt a pang of sadness but understood. "Wherever you go, they'll be lucky to have you," he said. "But promise me you'll keep in touch?" Robert smiled. "I will. And Lucas, don't forget what you've built here. It's more than an organization. It's a lifeline for so many people." They shook hands, and Lucas watched as Robert walked away, a figure who had become one of the most significant influences in his life. He knew their paths might not cross again, but Robert's wisdom and generosity would always guide him. Years later, the Lucas Marshall Foundation celebrated its 10th anniversary with a gala attended by hundreds of supporters, partners, and beneficiaries. Lucas stood on the stage, looking out at the crowd, a mix of wealthy donors and individuals whose lives had been transformed by the foundation's work. "I used to think success was about what you could accumulate," Lucas said, his voice steady and reflective. "But I've learned that true success is about what you can give back. It's about creating opportunities for others, building bridges, and lifting each other up." He paused, glancing at the photograph of his father and Robert, which had been placed on display as a tribute to the foundation's origins. This foundation exists because of a simple act of kindness, one man helping another, even when he had little to give. That act rippled outward, creating everything you see here today. My hope is that our work continues to create those ripples, spreading hope and opportunity far beyond what we can imagine. The audience rose to their feet, their applause thunderous. Lucas looked over at his father, who stood in the front row, his eyes brimming with pride. For the first time, Lucas felt a deep sense of peace, not because he had achieved something extraordinary, but because he had found his purpose. As the evening wound down, Lucas walked outside to the balcony overlooking the city. The lights stretched endlessly before him, a reminder of the countless lives still in need of help. He knew the work was far from over, but he welcomed the challenge. He whispered to himself, as he often did, the words that had come to define his journey: "Wealth isn't what you have. It's what you give." And with that, Lucas returned to the celebration, ready to continue the mission that had transformed his life and so many others. The years rolled by, and the Lucas Marshall Foundation became a global force for good, recognized for its innovative solutions and transformative impact on communities. Lucas, now a seasoned leader, continued to grow, not just as the face of the foundation but as a person deeply committed to understanding the complexities of inequality and human resilience. Despite his success, Lucas remained grounded. He often found himself reflecting on the moments that had shaped him, the cryptic words of a beggar, the harsh lessons from his father, and the life-changing mentorship of Robert. These memories were his compass, reminding him why he had started this journey and what truly mattered. One winter evening, Lucas received an unexpected letter. The envelope was old and slightly crumpled, and the handwriting on it was unfamiliar. As he opened it, a wave of nostalgia washed over him. Inside was a note from Robert, written in his characteristic straightforward style. "Lucas, I've kept up with your work, and I couldn't be prouder of what you've accomplished. You've become a beacon of hope for so many, and I know your father feels the same way. I wanted you to know that I've settled in a small town, spending my days helping those who need it most. It's not grand, but it's meaningful, and that's all I could ever ask for. Remember, wealth isn't about what you take with you, it's about what you leave behind. Keep building, keep giving, and keep inspiring. You're doing more than changing lives, Lucas, you're creating a legacy. Yours always, Robert." Lucas read the letter twice, his heart swelling with emotion. He hadn't seen Robert in years, but the man's influence was still present in every decision he made. Lucas resolved to visit him soon, wanting to thank him once more for the wisdom and kindness that had set his life on a new course. A few months later, Lucas traveled to the small town where Robert had made his home. It was a quiet place, surrounded by rolling hills and dotted with modest houses. Lucas found Robert working in a community garden, tending to rows of vegetables alongside a group of children and seniors. Robert looked up as Lucas approached, his face breaking into a wide smile. "Well, if it isn't the famous philanthropist," he said, wiping his hands on his pants. Lucas laughed, embracing him. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you." They spent the afternoon catching up, sharing stories of their work and the lives they had touched. Lucas marveled at Robert's humility and dedication, qualities that had remained unwavering despite the hardships he had faced. As he looked out at the bustling world beyond his window, Lucas felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. His life had been transformed not by wealth but by the people who had shown him its true purpose. And now, he was ready to pass that lesson on to the next generation. Lucas wrote a letter to his team and family, laying out his vision for the foundation's future. In it, he quoted Robert once again, "Never underestimate the power of a single act of kindness. It may not seem like much, but it can change the world." With that, Lucas closed his laptop, smiled to himself, and whispered, "Thank you, Robert. I'll keep planting seeds." And so, Lucas's journey came full circle, a testament to the enduring power of humility, redemption, and giving. His story, like Robert's, would ripple across generations, touching lives and leaving the world a better place. As Lucas entered the twilight years of his life, the legacy of the foundation and the lessons he had learned were stronger than ever. The Miller Centers had grown to over 100 locations worldwide, becoming beacons of hope and transformation for communities in need. Each center bore not only Robert's name but also the values that Lucas had worked tirelessly to instill: compassion, humility, and the belief in the power of collective action. Lucas remained deeply involved, traveling less but staying engaged with the foundation's mission. He spent much of his time mentoring young leaders, sharing his experiences, and ensuring the foundation's vision remained intact. A new generation steps up. One day, Lucas's son, Ethan, approached him in the family study. Ethan, now in his late 20s, had spent years observing his father's work. Unlike the young Lucas who had once been consumed by privilege, Ethan had grown up inspired by his father's transformation and the mission of the foundation. "Dad," Ethan began, his tone serious but excited, "I think it's time for me to take a bigger role at the foundation." Lucas looked up, his eyes studying his son with pride. "You've been preparing for this for years," he said. "Are you ready for the responsibility?" Ethan nodded. "I've learned from the best. I want to carry forward what you and Robert built, but I also want to take it further. There's still so much more we can do." Lucas smiled, the lines on his face softening. "I always hoped you'd want to be a part of this. Just remember, leadership isn't about control, it's about service. If you lead with your heart, the rest will follow." Over the next few months, Ethan immersed himself in the foundation's work, traveling to various Miller Centers and connecting with the communities they served. Lucas watched from the sidelines, offering guidance when needed but allowing Ethan the freedom to carve his own path. Ethan brought fresh energy and ideas to the foundation, expanding its focus to include environmental sustainability and digital literacy programs. Under his leadership, the Miller Centers became hubs for innovation, addressing modern challenges while staying true to their core mission. The final goodbye. One evening, as Lucas sat on the veranda of his home, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Ethan joined him, carrying a small notebook. It was a journal Lucas had kept over the years, filled with reflections, ideas, and notes about the foundation. "I found this in your office," Ethan said, handing it to his father. "It's incredible to see how much you've written about your journey." Lucas chuckled softly, flipping through the worn pages. "This journal has been my companion through it all. The highs, the lows, and everything in between." Ethan hesitated for a moment, then asked, "What's the one thing you want me to remember as I take on more responsibility?" Lucas closed the journal and looked at his son with a steady gaze. "Remember that this isn't about us. It's about the people we serve. Never let pride or ambition cloud the purpose of what we're doing." Ethan nodded, his expression solemn. "I won't forget." A few weeks later, Lucas gathered his closest family and friends for an intimate gathering. He knew his time was coming to an end, and he wanted to leave them with one final message. Standing in the center of the room, surrounded by the people who mattered most, Lucas spoke from the heart. "My life has been a testament to second chances. I was given the gift of transformation, and I've tried to honor that by giving back. But this journey doesn't end with me. It continues with all of you, with every life you touch, every act of kindness you share." He paused, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Robert once told me that the seeds we plant today will grow into trees we may never see. I've lived long enough to see some of those trees, and it's been the greatest joy of my life. Keep planting, keep growing, and never stop believing in the power of good." As the room erupted into applause, Lucas felt a deep sense of peace. He had done his part, and now it was time for the next generation to carry the torch. A legacy lives on. When Lucas passed away quietly in his sleep a few months later, the world mourned the loss of a visionary leader. Tributes poured in from all corners of the globe, leaders, activists, and everyday people whose lives had been touched by his work shared their gratitude and memories. Ethan took on the mantle of leadership with grace, ensuring that the foundation continued to thrive while honoring his father's values. At the dedication of a new Miller Center in Lucas's hometown, Ethan stood before a crowd, holding his father's journal. "This journal is filled with my father's dreams, lessons, and reflections," Ethan said. "But more importantly, it's a reminder that one person's journey can ignite change for countless others. My father's story didn't start as one of kindness and service, but it became one. And that's the greatest lesson he taught me, that it's never too late to make a difference." The crowd stood in silence, moved by Ethan's words. Above the entrance to the center, the foundation's motto was engraved. "Wealth isn't what you have. It's what you give." Lucas's story continued to inspire, a legacy of transformation, humility, and boundless compassion that would ripple across generations. And just as Robert had once believed in him, Lucas's life stood as proof that even the smallest seeds of kindness could grow into forests of hope. As the years passed, Lucas Marshall's legacy grew into something larger than even he could have envisioned. The foundation, now led by his son Ethan, became synonymous with hope and change. Its reach extended into the farthest corners of the world, addressing crises, empowering communities, and creating opportunities for millions. Ethan carried his father's values into every project, often quoting Lucas's mantra, "Wealth isn't what you have. It's what you give." The words, passed down from Robert, had become a universal reminder of what truly mattered. A tribute to Lucas. Decades after Lucas's passing, the foundation hosted a global summit to celebrate the 50th anniversary of its founding. Held in a sprawling auditorium in New York City, the event drew leaders, activists, and beneficiaries from across the globe. The air buzzed with excitement and emotion as people gathered to honor the man who had sparked a movement. Ethan, now in his 60s, stood on the stage, a striking reflection of his father's wisdom and compassion. Behind him, a massive screen displayed photos and videos from the foundation's history. Lucas mopping floors at the community center, the first Miller Center opening, and countless moments of transformation captured in smiles and tears. "Today, we celebrate a dream," Ethan began, his voice steady and filled with reverence. A dream that began with a simple act of kindness, a beggar helping a struggling businessman. That act sparked a legacy that has touched millions of lives, including mine. Ethan paused, his gaze sweeping the audience. My father taught me that true wealth isn't measured by what you own but by what you leave behind. He lived those words every day, and because of him, countless people have found hope, dignity, and purpose. The crowd erupted into applause as Ethan continued. This foundation isn't just about Lucas Marshall. It's about Robert Miller, about every volunteer, every beneficiary, and every person who believed in the power of giving. Together, we've planted seeds of change that will grow for generations. Unveiling the Legacy Monument. At the summit's conclusion, Ethan invited the audience to join him outside for the unveiling of a new tribute, the Lucas Marshall Legacy Monument. The monument, a towering sculpture of interconnected hands reaching toward the sky, symbolized the unity and collaboration that defined the foundation's work. At the base of the monument, two plaques were placed side by side. One bore Robert's immortal words, "Wealth isn't what you have. It's what you give." The other was a quote from Lucas himself, "Kindness ripples across generations. Be the one to start the wave." As the monument was revealed, a hush fell over the crowd. It was a moment of reflection and gratitude, a chance to honor not just the man who had inspired it all, but the values he had championed. A quiet reflection. That evening, Ethan sat on the steps of the monument, watching as visitors lingered to take in its beauty. Among them was a young woman holding a child, her face lit with awe. Ethan approached her gently. "What brings you here tonight?" he asked. The woman smiled. "I came to say thank you. The foundation scholarships helped me finish school, and now I'm a teacher. I wanted my son to see what kindness can do." Ethan's heart swelled with pride and humility. "My father would have loved to hear that," he said. "It's stories like yours that keep his legacy alive." As the woman walked away, Ethan looked up at the monument, its hands illuminated against the night sky. He thought of his father, his grandfather, and Robert, the man who had started it all with a single act of generosity. Their stories were intertwined, woven into a tapestry of hope that stretched across time and space. The final ripple. Years later, as Ethan prepared to step down from his leadership role, he reflected on the foundation's journey. His final act as chairman was to write a letter, much like his father and Robert had done before him. Addressed to the future leaders of the foundation, it read, "To those who continue this journey, this foundation was built on a simple truth. One act of kindness can change the world. My father believed it, and so do I. As you take on the responsibility of leading this mission, remember that our work isn't just about programs or projects. It's about people. It's about lifting each other up and believing in a better tomorrow. You are the stewards of a legacy that began long before us and will continue long after we're gone. Keep planting seeds, even when you can't see the harvest. Trust that your efforts will ripple across generations, just as Robert's did for my father, and my father's did for me. With hope and gratitude, Ethan Marshall." The letter was placed in the foundation's archives, alongside Lucas's journal and Robert's original note. Together, they told the story of a legacy that began with humility, flourished through service, and endured through love. The Lucas Marshall Foundation remained a symbol of hope and change for generations to come. And just as Robert had once said, the seeds planted by those who cared would continue to grow, shaping a brighter future for the world.